Alright, so before we start today's Titans review, I want to go over a couple of things. First of all, I want to apologize for there not being many clips in this review. I try to include clips of any particularly visually interesting thing that I talk about as examples for what I'm talking about. Like if I find the action in the episode noteworthy enough to dwell on it for any length of time, even if I'm not going to specifically comment on its quality, I like to show an example so you guys understand that it is worth paying attention to. But the problem with the action in this episode in particular is most of the action stuff, a lot of the episode in general, but most of the action stuff takes place in a snowy Russian environment. And I still can't find any high quality rips of these episodes, these final season episodes. And man, is it hard on the eyes to watch those scenes in the snowy, blizzardy environments, especially when there's motion going on, when the video quality is super low and pixely. It kind of gave me a headache. Also, I want to get it out of the way at the top of this video because I'm going to forget otherwise, because that's just how my brain works. But the next couple of weeks on my channel are going to be a little different than usual. We have 2 weeks before the second season of The Owl House starts up, and I have 8 episodes left to review from season 1. And I think 8 episodes, roughly the length of my typical Owl House review, is basically my limit in terms of how many episodes I can get out in 2 weeks. So over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be finishing out season 1 of The Owl House on this channel, so that come the 12th and then the 13th, because I'm going to need a day to get the review done, I can start reviewing season 2 as it's being released, like I did with Amphibia for a while, which is going to bum out anybody who doesn't particularly follow my Owl House stuff, but will certainly excite anyone who does. Just wanted to let you guys know this is going to be my last non-Owl House video until, I guess, the Tuesday following June 12th. That said, I found this particular episode, Snowblind, of Teen Titans to be particularly interesting. I didn't remember this one going into it. Like, there are some things from it I kind of half remember now that I've watched it, but I still don't know if I actually saw it, or if I, saw promos for it, or if I'm just remembering the character who's introduced here, the Titan who's introduced here, Red Star, from his other appearance in this season. Because even though this episode does try to leave it kind of ambiguous whether or not he survives these events, we do see him again, and his powers are even more fully realized then than they seem to be here, if I recall correctly. In fact, if I am recalling correctly, when we see him again, they kind of just basically transplant Starfire's power set onto him. Like, he already has some of the same abilities as her here. He can survive in space, he can discharge energy, he's resistant to various forms of energy, including radiation. But if I'm not mistaken, he, has flight and stuff, independent flight and stuff later as well. Which is interesting, because in the comics, this character was called Starfire until he was, they revamped the team and he wasn't on the team anymore. And then we were introduced to the current modern iteration of Starfire, the one we think of, the one's a main character in this show. And then he was reintroduced later and given the name Red Star so it wouldn't conflict with hers. And I don't recall what his full power set was in the comics. I haven't read a lot of Teen Titans comics overall, in terms of how many there are. And I haven't, in particular, I haven't read many with him in them. But I don't think that's wholly inaccurate to his power set in the comics. I could be wrong about that, though. It's just an interesting parallel, I think. And I don't know if this is true or not, but it makes me wonder if the female Tamaranian Starfire was an attempt to create a legacy character of him, specifically. And then they just kind of retconned later that both characters exist at the same time. I also am pretty sure his origin story in the comics is different than here, but his origin story in this episode was so interesting. We see it in a flashback, and it's so interesting, and I'll talk about that in a second. Because the story of this one is exceedingly simple. The Titans show up in Russia to help a Russian city that's under attack from some sort of radioactive creature. They have trouble fighting it because radiation is dangerous to all of them except for Starfire. They can't get super close to it, which Cyborg points out in a scene where he seems to be using a Geiger counter on his arm to register that the thing is too radioactive for them to touch it. And while he is shown later to have a sensor that can detect radioactive energy from a distance. If he was using the Geiger counter to get those initial readings, then they're already dead because the radiation would already be that severe where he's standing, which I just thought was kind of funny. You having fun, Klaus? But it does make fighting it difficult, so Starfire is the only one who can do anything and therefore gets separated from the rest of the group. And gets knocked out by the freezing cold of a blizzard. Even though she can survive in space and survive radiation, therefore her body should be resilient enough that this doesn't affect her. So, okay, Klaus. Jeez, you're cute. And she ends up getting found by Red Star, and at first we think maybe he's the creature since he also gives off radiation energy. But then we learn that the creature is a separate entity that came from him. He periodically discharges energy into collection tubes, but there's waste from that has run off from the old nuclear facility, I guess is the best word for it, where he's living. And he specifically sheds all of the negative emotions he associates with these powers whenever he... Will you please lay down, bud? Whenever he discharges that energy. And that seems to have given this creature form and a personality and made it this destructive, rampaging beast. And so while he and the creature are not one thing, he does feel responsible for it, and that gets him to start being a hero and to fight against it, which in turn gets him to listen to the Titans when they tell him, Starfire in particular, when they tell him to embrace his powers and use them rather than try to suppress them until they eventually go nuts and he has to expel them into containment units. And this does lead to him effectively melting down by the end. Starfire has to fly him up into space. But he does stop the creature. He does save a lot of lives and even fix his reputation with the people down in the city who hate him for what he is. And later we do see him return with better control over his powers. So it seems like everything worked out. And considering that odd interconnected history of the two characters in the comics, I think it was a good choice to make Starfire the person who ends up bonding with him the most here. Especially considering that she, better than anyone else, except maybe Raven, understands how superpowers often tie themselves to emotions. And her whole thing is about feeling emotions and letting the power out and it being a joyous thing that's to be celebrated. So that being the message that he needed to hear, and him having a relationship with Starfire, a trusting relationship with her, helping him to hear that made a lot of sense. In fact, they seem to have been building a lot of parallels between him and Starfire here. Like, his costume doesn't look anything like hers or anything, but his eyes glow green constantly, very much like the comic book version of Starfire's eyes do. And much like Starfire, he's a very polite, kind-hearted, good person who just happens to have this really fierce power dwelling within them, this power that could hurt a lot of people. It just so happens that his is a little more passively destructive than hers is, on top of everything else. And it doesn't hurt that she's the only person who can be near him when he's really powered up, too. Like, right up near him, considering she's immune to radiation. Like, I'm trying to think. I could see Raven maybe being the one who bonded with him here and it working pretty well, but it works super well that it's Starfire. And the fact that the characters in the comics do have that odd relationship between them adds an extra layer to it for fans that are aware of both. And I do like Red Star a lot. I think he's basically a generic good guy character. He was a Russian soldier, a Russian army soldier, but like, he was a good person first, right? Which is reflected in the parallels in his origin story that I'll talk about in a second. So like, there's a bit of a genericness to him, but between the way they animate the character and the way the voice actor handles the role, he still comes across as very likable. And once he starts to open up to the Titans, he's like teasing with them and stuff. It was very cool. He's a good fit for this group. Just like a lot of these what are they calling them, honorary Titans? Just like a lot of these honorary Titans turn out to be. His origin story, though, was of particular interest to me, considering some of the other stuff in this episode. He's basically Captain America, except instead of super soldier soup, he gets his powers from radiation experiments. But it was very intentional. He was a soldier who was a good person first and a soldier second, who was scrawny and then used in an experiment that turned him into a super soldier with peak physical condition. It just so happens that the nature of the experiment is one that used radiation, meant that he got a comic book power origin twofer, became a super soldier and a radioactive being at the same time. And again, I don't think that's his comic book origin story. I think he got it from like exposure to like an engine core or something, if I'm remembering correctly. I'm probably wrong about that. But it's super interesting because with this origin, someone had to create him. And I looked up the name of the character just to make sure I was right. It's that Dr. Chang guy from the episode X, where somebody's using the red X suit and they're trying to figure out who. And so they retrace some of Robin's steps in creating it, specifically the steps that he took in creating the power system for the suit. And that's where we learn about that red compound. Started with a Z, I think? I can't remember. I looked it up and I can't remember. But it's that volatile red compound that's a very potent power source, but it's dangerous. And if you look, because Chang was the supplier of that to Robin when he made the red X suit, if you look, the energy that Red Star sheds and puts in those containment units is also red. I think it's that compound, but a more stable version of it than what Chang was dealing, because we see the radiation creature blast through a wall, exploding several of the containers with that compound in it, and they don't themselves then further explode. It doesn't seem to be volatile like the version from the episode X was said to be. Which means that when the Titans insist that Red Star could be helping a lot of people, and in fact call out that all of this material could be powering cities, they're right. And I think he could be doing so relatively safely, too. I don't recall it ever being brought up in the show again. The implications of that are very interesting. And like, the radiation creature has these 4 eyes on its head that are even roughly X-shaped, creating a weird connection between this creature and Red Star and X and Chang that I don't think is ever explored. Like, I don't think it's ever even mentioned. I think it's just all implied here for us to pick up on, if we pick up on it, and probably in case they got a season 6, right? But man, is it interesting to think about. Like, I don't know where my thoughts on it are going to take me. Like, where could they? This show's lore is kind of loosey-goosey anyway. But man, is it just... There's so many details in this episode that don't need to be there for this episode to tell the story that it does, and yet they are, and that shows a level of care being put into the episode that goes above and beyond. It's noteworthy. Overall, though, this episode was a perfectly fine introduction to a likable character who fits well with this team. The added intrigue is just icing on the cake of that. As per usual, though, I'd like to know what you guys think of the Teen Titans episode Snowblind. If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, you might as well like the video, share it with anyone else you think would enjoy my content. Subscribe if you haven't. You can also check out links to my social medias, as well as the various ways you can help the channel. Those will be in the video description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.